Hello everybody. So today, right, we are going to get into the digestive system. Before we do, I hope everyone's doing well in our not quarantine, but stay at home order, whatever it happens to be. Hope everyone's staying healthy, practicing proper hygiene, of course. If you're looking for any amazing shows to binge watch, one is Ozark, absolutely phenomenal. Two, Schitt's Creek, just absolutely just gut-wrenchingly funny, right? Um, of course, after you're done studying and stuff like that, that's when you have time to binge watch these sorts of things. Grab yourself a carton of ice cream and just plop down and enjoy whatever show it is you want to watch. Um, so, regardless of all of that, right? When we think about the digestive system, there's a number of things, hormones, a number of molecules, processes, functions that the digestive system is going to carry out, right? We just got through and just got done covering the endocrine system. So the endocrine system we talked about, right, really in large part the various hormones of the body, from those hormones which were released from the hypothalamus to the hormones which are then released from the pituitary or the thyroid or the adrenal gland, or even from the bone or from adipose tissue. There were so many different hormones. And one of the things with digestion, for instance, as far as, how is it that we know we are no longer hungry? Right? I've eaten food. Man, I'm like, whew, I'm full, I'm satiated, I'm not hungry anymore. Well, there's different hormones which are released. Okay, that's endocrine system. But some of those hormones travel or are released from the hypothalamus. Right, and so it's your hypothalamus which helps to regulate whether or not you are or aren't hungry. Right, so we're going to go through digestion. We're going to go through kind of how it is our body can digest the food that you throw inside of it. Right, the entire idea that all these chemical processes, the creation of all these different hormones, the generation of all these proteins, the synthesis of all these, of all these molecules, all come from somewhere. Right? And where they come from is the food that you eat. Yes, our intestines can produce a very select few vitamins and fatty acids, but by and large, the overwhelming majority of the nutrients that our body needs on a daily basis, we need to consume through the diet. Right? So assuming the food that we actually ate has nutrients, I'm pretty sure something like Starburst or some gummy, right? My kids love gummies. I'm pretty sure they're void of any possible nutrient. You just look at it, it's just like corn syrup and a bunch of food dye. So there might be a small amount of nutrient, but even then, right? Some animals, I think gerbils, hamsters, they can produce vitamin C from sugar and glucose. We, however, cannot. So you know what? There actually may not be any nutrient content to something like that. Anyways, moving forward, we see the role of digestion. Right? Again, the food that we eat, the nutrients that we eat, we want those nutrients to get inside of the body. Right? Same thing. Whereas when we breathe, you covered respiratory system last semester. The oxygen you breathe into the lungs. Right? The only way it benefits the body is if that oxygen goes from the lungs, crosses the alveolar wall, crosses the blood vessel wall, and enters into the bloodstream. Right? Waste products. Right? The myriad, just like any chemical process, there's some sort of waste product that is generated. Well, in almost all. Right? Just your car. You start your car up. It utilizes the fuel in the car, and the byproduct of the exhaust is produced. Our body's no different. There are thousands of different chemical processes occurring around the clock inside of the body. Some of them generate waste products. Well, almost all of them generate waste products. However, some of the byproducts are utilized in other processes, other chemical processes. So at the end of the line, or end of the game, end of the road, those waste products which we have to eliminate. Right? If there's excess sodium, if there's excess potassium, if there's BUN, if there's creatinine, whatever it happens to be, we have to have a way to eliminate that waste product and to regulate the level of that particular molecule in the blood. So if we need to get rid of excess sodium ions, if we need to get rid of BUN or creatinine, we can do that through the urine. Well, when we talk about nutrients, how is it that we can ingest or regulate the nutrients getting inside of the body? Remember, last recording, last presentation, we talked about parathyroid hormone. Just think about that and try to remember what it does for a second. Right? Parathyroid hormone functions to elevate blood calcium levels. Something else that parathyroid hormone did was cause the release of something called calcitriol from the kidney. Calcitriol functioned to increase the absorption of calcium through the diet. That was one of the functions, right? Something else it did was help to eliminate less calcium through the urine, right? But let's just stick with digestion for a minute. We'll cover urinary in a couple of weeks. Not everything we eat gets absorbed into the body, right? You might say, well, it's in my mouth, I swallowed it, it's in my intestines, therefore it's in the body. Well, kind of, sort of, but kind of, sort of not. Right? Anything that remains in your intestines, you are going to defecate out in the toilet, the tree, whatever, the blue bowl, wherever you are. Right? So technically, if it's still in the intestines, it's not inside of the body. The body has to be able to absorb that nutrient through the intestinal wall, through the capillary wall, and then that nutrient actually enters into the bloodstream. So that's the importance of, that is the Cliff Note versions of digestion. We've got to somehow get that food that we're eating to a small enough size where it will actually fit through the intestinal wall. And that's where we're going to, it took me about 7 minutes to explain to you what digestion is, what it does, and then we're going to spend the next 3 or so classes talking about that entire kind of concept and process. So when we first begin to talk about digestion, right? Digestion, when does it occur? All right, it occurs, really it starts to occur before you actually even put food in your mouth, right? I would kill for like an oatmeal raisin cookie or a white chocolate chip macadamia nut. My wife makes these, I think like monster cookies, like an oatmeal peanut butter M&M type thing. Good God Almighty, these things are killer. Anyways, I think about these things and I just start to just salivate. I'm like a Doberman. Well, why does that happen? I didn't actually put food in my mouth. Right? It's one of the, call it downsides of having food, right, so overly abundant. Right? Think of, right, in class, well, excuse me, we're not in class, but hypothetically, if we were actually in the classroom, right, just think of how close all of the different, right, vending machines, all the different food options are. I'm not even talking about the caf, right, assuming we were on campus, right, just I can think of 4 vending machines right down the hall, and then down below there's another 4 or 5 vending machines. Within 100 yards, I can think of probably a dozen different vending machines where you can actually go to get food. Right? There's not many places you can be where you are not unbelievably close to food. There's just not. Right? Food didn't used to be nearly this available. Right, even just a couple hundred years ago, right? Food wasn't just like, all right, I'm hungry, open up a bag or a pantry, and boom, there you go, you're done. So the idea was kind of just evolutionarily, we have, right, whenever we were around food, we were going to consume said food. Hence the reason why, just simply the seeing food, smelling food, hearing food, which you're like, how the hell do you hear food? Think of a cast iron skillet, right? That food sizzling, right? So all of those things, seeing food, smelling food, right? Hearing food, right? All of those things actually begin certain phases of digestion. We'll talk about those specific phases later on, but digestions are actually already begun to occur. So much so that even just seeing food, smelling food, right, being around food, literally stimulates your appetite. Right? All of these different digestive processes are beginning to occur, and that's going to stimulate your appetite. So that's why kind of like, whatever, dieting 101, or I hate the term dieting, but just like, food 101, right? Make the food less available for you if you don't want to eat it. Right? We are literally designed to want to consume food when we are around it. Right? The idea like, oh man, I gotta not eat this food. There's this internal drive saying, oh, there's food there, I'm supposed to eat it. Right? So that's why I make it less available, and it just makes it that much easier. Anyways, when we kind of talk about food, obviously the digestion, right? That all begins to occur up here in the oral cavity, right? There's the salivary glands. We'll get to those in a minute. There's the pharynx. There's the esophagus, right? The esophagus is that tube, that food tube, carrying the food from the oral cavity down to the stomach. And then from the stomach all the way down through the intestines, that's where you really start to have the bulk of digestion and absorption actually occurring. Right, so here in this next slide, we're going to take a look at the oral cavity and take a look at all of the different features and functions that are carried out beginning at the oral cavity. Right. So again, what kind of digestion occurs here? Right, there's different types of digestion. There's mechanical digestion, and there's chemical digestion. Right, mechanical digestion is, all right, take a chunk of ice, smash it with a hammer. That's mechanical digestion. What's chemical digestion? Take an ice cube, dump salt all over it. That's chemical digestion. All right, both of these things are going to occur in the mouth. Right, your teeth. Right, we have teeth for a reason. It's not just so they can be white and look however they're going to look. Right, there's a reason as to why we have teeth in the arrangement that we do. So again, the front four teeth, right, these incisors, literally act like teeth. Oh, yeah, they literally act like teeth. Who knew? Teeth acted like teeth. Right, the incisors, they act like scissors. Right, they snip off, they clip off, they cut off the food for which you're, putting in your mouth. The canines, those kind of sharp, pointy teeth to the side. Right, these kind of sharp, pointy teeth to the side here. Right, up here as well. Right. These are designed to kind of rip and tear food that you've just eaten. So if you're eating whatever, steak, if you're eating, it doesn't have to be a steak, a piece of lettuce, whatever it happens to be. Right, the canine is designed to puncture the food and then kind of tear into it. Then you have the premolars and the molars. Right, they are what legitimately act as kind of the mortar and the pestle. Right, mortar and pestle. You put in some seeds, whatever happens to be in a mortar, or excuse me, a pestle. Sorry, and then you can take the mortar and then literally just kind of grind it up into this fine, fine powdery mesh. Right, this fine powder. Right, that's the entire purpose to the molars, is to grind up the food. Now, some other features of the mouth that can help benefit this. All right, the tongue. Right, our tongue is immensely important for a number of things. Right, linguistics. Right, whatever sound it is that you make. Right, our vocal cords vibrate and produce this sound. Our tongue, our lips, right, the muscles in the throat, the muscles in the mouth, all function in unison to manipulate that sound into some sort of word, right? Some sort of word that you can actually understand. So some features inside of the mouth, right? The hard palate, right? If you take your tongue and just touch it to the roof of your mouth, Again, that the kind of the front 2/3 of the roof of the mouth is hard. Yeah. Does anybody remember the bone that is? Give you about 4 seconds. One, so you can think about it, but then two, really more importantly, so I can take a sip of my coffee. Did anybody say the maxilla? Yeah, you lie. You probably didn't. But it is the maxilla, right? The hard palate. That's, if you remember, right? The maxilla. That's the if you kind of tap your top gums, if you tap to the bone to the side of your nose, right? That's the maxilla. And the hard palate makes up, or the hard palate is within the maxilla. Now, from the hard palate, if you keep sliding your tongue backwards, right? Touch your tongue to the roof of your mouth, and then slide it backwards, right? Eventually, you get to this soft, kind of muscly portion. That is the soft palate, right? That's the soft palate. Okay. Part of the soft palate, right, we see the uvula. Let me get a different color. This guy, right back in there. The uvula. That's a muscle. That hangs down for a reason. That helps to prevent food from getting up into the nasal cavity. We'll look at that. We'll look at next slide or the slide thereafter. But we'll talk about the importance of the uvula and why it kind of exists. Why is it just something that it just dangles there? So your doctor can say, say ah, and you say ah, and he's just like, all right, or she's like, all right, whatever. There's a reason why this thing exists, right? We're going to talk. We'll talk about that in a probably 4 or 5 slides. I think we'll get to it. So when we first look at mechanical digestion, right, we talk about the tooth, right? Without the tooth, right, really we are at a pretty substantial, not a loss, but we are at a pretty substantial uphill battle when it comes to digestion, right? There's each phase of digestion. There's certain steps of digestion. Some occur in the mouth, some occur in the stomach, some occur in the intestine, right? But they all work together to cause digestion. Well, if one of them doesn't pick up the snuff, for instance, right, I had a guy, really, oh my God, such a guy I worked with years ago. I was in college job, super ridiculously, unbelievably nice guy. He was older, right? He would do a lot of kind of maintenance stuff. He only had 3 teeth in his head. Super, super nice guy. One day I asked him, hey, what do you want for lunch? He's like, I'm going to get a sub. He goes, I'd kill for a roast beef sub, but I better get tuna fish because I can't chew the roast beef. And I just laugh because, again, how I'd mentioned, right, those incisors, they act like scissors. When you bite into food, they help pull it off. And that was one of the issues he has. His 3 bottom teeth, he basically had like 2 premolars in his canine. That was it. So he didn't have any ability to actually kind of snip or kind of bite off any of the food he was chewing into, right? And so when I say periodontitis, kind of leads me into it, right? From where I was from and way upstate New York, like periodontitis, that wasn't the exception, that was the norm, right? Like that was, if you didn't have it, everyone's like, ugh, you don't have it, get away from me, right? That's how bad it was. All right, it wasn't that, well, it was that bad, but that's all right. But periodontitis. Right, this ligament, right, we're seeing here, right here, all these ligaments, and I'm kind of drawing these yellow slits on, right, those are the periodontal ligament. It surrounds the tooth all the way around, right, it helps essentially hold the tooth in the socket, right. So if somebody has periodontitis, all right, that just means the periodontal ligament has become irritated and inflamed. So if it's become irritated and inflamed, the ligaments start to become a little bit more, again, when the inflammation sets in, they become weakened, they become a bit more lax. When that happens, the tooth becomes loose, and eventually, if it's not corrected, the tooth will simply fall out. Right. Down and through here, and I'll grab a different color here. Right. Down in this part here. That is again, we talk about like the almighty root canal, right? This is the nerve, right? The root canal, there's a nerve which runs through, that canal. If I have some sort of dental cavity or a carie, and it's causing pain in the tooth, all right, well, we can just come in here and just, drill down and just destroy this nerve. Hence, hence the reason doing a root canal. If I destroy this nerve, well, if there's no nerve, guess what isn't there to carry any sort of pain? Oh, the nerve. Hence the reason why that's done, to eliminate the pain. There's other reasons why it's done for sure, but just as far as a pain standpoint, right? So with the tooth, right, again, the hardest substance in the body, again, the enamel, that's the white part of the tooth, right? This is the stuff that we, again, want to strengthen to prevent any sort of, cavities or caries, anything like that. The dentin, just calcified connective tissue, right? This is the majority of the tooth, right? Nowhere near as hard as the enamel, right? It's calcified, it's hard, don't get me wrong, but it's not near the hardness of the enamel, right? And part of the issue with our current lifestyle, current food options, the issue with drinking, right, like for instance, like sugared beverages, or eating as often or as frequently as we do, right? We eat ridiculously often in really in many countries, but in this country in particular, right? The average person eats some, whether it's a bite of, whether it's a chip, whether it's a Hershey Kiss, or whether it's a meal. They eat something every 2 hours, right? When we throw a beverage in there, right, outside of water, right, it's every half an hour. If, let's imagine that food that you, or that let's say if you are, or you drink coffee, right, let's say it has cream or sugar in it, right, or if you are drinking tea with sugar or honey, or if you are eating whatever food it happens to be, right, when you are constantly exposing the mouth to a fresh source of glucose, one of the primary ways, or one of the primary issues with kind of, constantly nibbling and sipping on food and on liquid, is that the bacteria in the mouth constantly have a fresh source of glucose to ferment, which, okay, who cares? Well, the problem, or why you should care, is the fact that when the bacteria ferment this glucose, they actually produce an acid, and that acid is what is going to erode the enamel, right? So that's the issue. That's the problem with, hey, right, just, I just my whatever latte, or I'm drinking sugared coffee or a sugared tea or soda, just constantly throughout the day, as you are exposing, or you are basically supplying the bacteria with a fresh source of glucose. And each time you do that, they simply ferment that glucose and produce an acid which erodes through your enamel. Right? So if you're going to drink a soda, just chug that puppy down. Just slam it down. You'll be okay. So, excuse me. We see increasing the surface area of the food. Yeah, in large part, or when we kind of simplified, like what is the purpose to grinding up the food? What is the purpose to chewing our food? And it's to increase the surface area of the food, right? Because the chemicals, which we're going to get into here in a second, the chemicals which digest the food, for instance, the saliva. The saliva contains salivary amylase. It contains salivary lipase, right? Those are, or it's something called lingual lipase, right? Those are different enzymes or chemicals which are going to break down the food, right? The amylase is going to break down the starches. The lipase is going to help to break down some of the lipids. So if I take that, actually sticking with my analogy from earlier with the ice cube and the salt. just going to think about it. I'm just going to pose this question and give you about 10 seconds to think about it. Right? If I were to take a ice cube and just dump salt on it, or if I were to take an ice cube and smash it up with a hammer and then dump salt on it, which one would melt more quickly? I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to think about it. I lost count. I think that was somewhere around 10 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, 10 seconds. So I hope, right, you would think that, well, if I want that salt to melt the ice cube faster, I'm going to smash up the ice cube first and then dump the salt on it. If you did, pat yourself on the back. If you got a bad shoulder, have somebody else pat you on the back. If there's nobody else there, I don't know, walk up to a door frame and, just slam your shoulder into that a couple times, right? Because that's the whole purpose. That's the entirety of why we chew food for digestion's sake, right? We want to make sure that if we want the chemical, if we want the enzyme to digest the starches or to digest the lipids, they have to come into contact with it, period. Right? Just like with the hormones, if I want the hormones to, quote unquote, activate a muscle, or a muscle, if I want them to, quote unquote, activate a particular cell, if insulin wants to cause my muscle cell to uptake glucose, that insulin has to come into contact with the receptor. If it doesn't, nothing's going to happen. Same idea here. If I want that salivary amylase, or if I want that lipase to begin to break down the food in my mouth, it has to come into contact with it. If it doesn't come into contact with it, it cannot possibly enact on it, right? So again, the whole purpose, increasing the surface area of the food, right? That's the purpose behind mechanical digestion. So we can see, increasing the surface area of food allows for increased chemical digestion. The other thing is, our food, chewing, right? That's also going to stimulate the release of saliva, right? And that saliva is going to help aid the food, lubrication of food as it travels in the mouth, as it travels in the into the pharynx and down the esophagus. One of the other things is regarding the function of the tongue, I didn't cover a minute ago, is our tongue. Right? That's one of the ways that we can ensure our food gets all mixed and mingled with the saliva as effectively as possible. Right? Our tongue moves the food up and down from side to side, making sure that the food mixes with the saliva. When we talk about the secretion of saliva, right, sure, even just when we chew, right, our temporalis muscle or our masseter muscle, right, that stimulates the release of saliva. Something else that happens, right, the parotid gland. This guy here, the parotid gland. That's the parotid gland. This is the masseter. It actually runs behind the parotid gland. It'll probably run about something like that. Well, if you've ever seen yourself chew food or chew gum in the mirror, I don't know, just humor me, just imagine yourself, or pop a piece of gum in your mouth and go stand in front of a mirror and just watch yourself chew for a minute. And just think of the correlation of where the masseter, this guy here, think of where that is in relation to the parotid gland. Right? Assuming you had done that, which I'm sure you didn't, but I'll just assume you did. When you look in kind of the, where the masseter is, right, kind of where the angle of the mandible is, it kind of pops out and it kind of gets nice and kind of swells up. Oh yeah, Makes kind of sense. When I chew food, my masseter kind of gets enlarged. Well, what happens is when it happens, it literally almost kind of like massages the parotid gland. So what happens? It almost acts like kind of like a, think of a water balloon, right? Where you, as you squeeze that water balloon, you release more and more of the water inside of it. Same idea here. As the masseter swells, as it contracts, that helps kind of squish out some of the saliva from the parotid gland. That's not the only means by any. There are other ways that it can be released, but that's one of the main means by which the parotid gland releases its saliva. Let's all think of it as almost like a salivary massage, if you will. Great. Once the food's been chewed up, right, it mixes with all the salivary juices. The next place it has to go is to the stomach. I really need to get a better image of the stomach. I don't know why I chose that one. Yeah, I really don't know why. But it has to go to the stomach. Maybe it's because, depending on what you eat, right? Five Guys, right? What's your stomach look like if you just ate Five Guys? Yeah, that one. What's your stomach look like if you just ate a kale salad? Ugh, that one. Actually, I should probably go with green, because it's kale salad, and kale's green, and it makes me green. Ugh. Right. Perhaps that's the reason why I use this one. But the next stop is to go to the stomach. But first off, how do we get there, right? How is it that food goes from the oral cavity and how it actually gets down into the stomach? Right, so that's what we're going to look at. Right, when we think about, right, the oral cavity, that this guy, that's hard to see. Oral cavity, awesome. This is where the food is. Right, that's where your food is. Cool. So a couple of things, right? This region from approximately here all the way down to here. That's the pharynx. Now there's more specific parts, right? The top portion, right? From here to about here, right? This region here, that's the nasopharynx, right? Nasal cavity. So combine nasal cavity and pharynx, and that combines to nasopharynx. Oh, nasopharynx. From here to about here, right? This is the oropharynx. And then last but not least, from approximately here to here, right? That's the laryngopharynx. That's the laryngopharynx. So when I go to, right, swallow food, my tongue's going to move in a way. We're going to look at what's called the deglutition reflex, that swallowing reflex, on this next slide here, next slide or two. Right, but that's the means by which we can actually swallow food down into, right, the esophagus. Now, when we breathe, right, generally you want to breathe in through your nasal cavity. Air comes in, down, and around, and air enters into the trachea to go down to the lungs. Awesome. Right. When you eat food, and I sure as hell don't want that to happen. I don't want it to go in through my nose. I want it to go inside my mouth. I want it to go from there down into the esophagus and then down into the stomach. Cool. There's got to be some sort of regulation or regulatory function of this, and there is, right, significantly. Right, one of the functions or one of the features that allows for this kind of diversion is this thing right here, right, called the epiglottis. That is the epiglottis, right? This is a flap of connective tissue, right? Really, it's cartilage. But what's going to happen is when I swallow, the epiglottis is going to shift downwards. When it shifts downwards, it's going to close off this opening to the trachea. So therefore, any food in the mouth that I swallow, it can't go down the trachea, so the only place for it to go is down into the esophagus. From the esophagus, down into the stomach. Cool. This opening, right there, that's something called the glottis. Just the opening into the, the opening down into the trachea. Hence the reason why the cartilage which blocks that or prevents that, or blocks it, right, blocks food from entering into the trachea. That's why that flap of cartilage is called the epiglottis or the epiglottis. So here's the deglutition reflex. We see swallowing is the process which carries contents from your pharynx down to your stomach. So what happens here? All right. If we look here, that's the uvula. All right. When I first begin, I put food in my mouth. When I first start swallowing, the uvula is open. There's an opening from the nasal cavity down into the pharynx. When I swallow, you can see here on the left, well, that was just god-awful. Before I swallow, this is open. As I swallow, oop, crap, it's shut. Right. There's a reason why that happens, right? Let me get all the stuff off of the screen. When we swallow, what happens to the tongue? The tongue is going to shift posteriorwards and upwards. Kind of in that fashion, right? Think of it. It goes from here and it shifts upwards and posteriorwards. So when that happens, the uvula, which again here it's open, here it's open. When we swallow, the uvula shifts posteriorwards, presses up against the wall of the pharynx, and food doesn't go up into the nasal cavity. Nope. It goes down into the esophagus. Because remember, at that same token, at that same time that we swallow, the epiglottis closes over top of the glottis and prevents any sort of food from getting down into the trachea. Now, you're like, oh, a couple of things. I've gotten milk or food in my nose before. I laughed so hard I shot milk or whatever it was out of my nose. Yeah, I mean, this isn't like foolproof, right? Think of it. If you were to when you increase your intra-abdominal pressure, so for instance, if you sneeze, swallow, cough, laugh, all of those things increase the pressure within your abdominal cavity. When that happens, that's going to increase the pressure inside of the thoracic cavity, which is then going to forcefully cause you to exhale. Right? Think of an incredibly quick, involuntary, forceful exhalation. That's coughing and sneezing. Right? They generate huge amounts of pressure. Huge amounts of pressure. So if there's food, right, in your mouth, you swallow it down. Let's say at the same token somebody makes you laugh, or you go to cough. So much pressure is generated, and you keep your mouth shut because you got food in it, that pressure overtakes the strength of the uvula, and food gets up into the nasal cavity, and it comes out whatever, your nose or whatever it happens to be, right? Or if you're like my kids, my youngest, it was a what was it? It was a Barbie shoe that my youngest put up her nose. It was a Barbie shoe. My son, it was a Lego head. He put that up his nose. And his twin sister decided to put a veggie straw up her nose, which she could still breathe through, so it was quite funny. But yeah, kids, I mean, God bless them. This was just a couple days ago when they're 7 and 8 years old. So no, I'm just kidding. It wasn't just a couple days ago. It was last week. So a couple other things to think about. People who have swallowing issues, right? Actually, let's back up. Even people who don't have swallowing issues, right? Just this morning, taking a sip of water. I apparently forgot how to swallow there for a minute, and a little bit got down in here, and I just went into a coughing spell. Right. Lasted, I don't know, 30 seconds, but I was fine. Right, but why does that happen? Sometimes because, think of it, we swallow millions upon millions upon millions of times. Right? Even if we have a 99.9999999% success rate, you're still going to kind of, quote unquote, choke on or kind of get something down the wrong tube hundreds of times in your life. Right? Even with a virtually perfect success, whatever, quote unquote, swallowing rate. So don't think, oh my gosh, this has happened. It's really not that big of an issue, right? Because as that liquid or food starts to enter here, we initiate coughing, and it works its way out. Awesome. If, let's say, if you've had a stroke or something like that, or you have some sort of neurodegenerative disease which is impacting, function of the motor neurons, for instance, right? If you have a difficulty swallowing, right, or difficulty regulating, right, the movement of the muscles in this area here, well, just of the things that we talked about. All right, so the epiglottis has to, well, let's back up. The tongue has to shift posteriorwards and upwards. The uvula has to close against the pharynx, right? That bolus of food enters into the pharynx. The epiglottis has to close, right? Right there is a movement. That's just 4 simple movements. I haven't talked anything about peristalsis or the activity of the esophagus. I haven't talked about any of that yet. Right? Swallowing is a very complex task. It is seemingly simple. You can swallow once, twice, right, 15 times right in a row with no problem. No problem at all. But the problem is that swallowing, right, the first part of swallowing is all voluntary. You can think about it. Or you think about it, and then you actually consciously and voluntarily control it. But that's just the first part. The last part, the back half of the swallow, you don't think about. You don't think about the epiglottis closing over top of the glottis. Right? You don't think about the upper esophageal sphincter relaxing to allow the food or liquid to enter it. You don't think about or control those things. So the last half of swallowing is all involuntary. It's controlled by different parts of the brain. So that's why, somebody who has had a stroke or somebody who has some sort of, neurodegenerative condition, right? Certain ones of them. That's why they're at an increased risk of developing swallowing issues, because it's a numbers game. If a greater amount of the brain is devoted to a particular function, if you have some sort of damage in the brain, the odds of you hitting one of those areas is higher, right? So, next we see, right, when we think of this bolus of food, right, shifting down into the esophagus, right? Oh, one of the things, and actually, let me back up. The whole point of me going into swallowing issues, I completely didn't. When there's issues with, for instance, the epiglottis closing over top of the glottis, somebody can aspirate. And what that means is essentially they've gotten some food or liquid, could be even vomit, they've breathed it in. That's a problem, right? We're not supposed to have liquid or food or vomit or anything like that in the lungs. So if that somehow gets there, right, that food, that liquid can begin to basically cause a localized irritation, eventually inflammation, and then an infection, right, which then oftentimes can lead to aspiration pneumonia, if you've ever heard of that, right? That's where somebody has, again, breathed in, again, liquid, food, vomit, whatever it happens to be, and that breathed in, let's just call it food, right, again, becomes infected or causes a localized infection, and then that person can develop aspiration pneumonia, for instance. So, great, we swallow. Right, we swallow, that food goes into the esophagus and eventually carries it down to the stomach. Cool. So, for that to happen, the upper esophageal sphincter has to relax. Right, this guy way up in here. Right, the upper esophageal sphincter, it has to relax. The esophagus in and of itself, so this food tube from essentially here all the way down to, as much as we can see, hidden behind the liver a little bit, but all the way down here, that's the esophagus. That's the food tube. That's what's going to carry the food from this region here of the pharynx all the way down to the stomach. Right, now that process is something called peristalsis. Right, the next slide, we're going to look at that process and kind of what it entails. But think of the kind of a pinching and pulling motion, right? The esophagus pinches and then pulls and propels that food down into the stomach. But one of the things with the esophagus is it contains a huge number of mucus glands, right? Food is frictionful. Frictionful? I'm sure as hell don't think that's a word, but food is abrasive. It can produce a large amount of friction. Right? Because of the fact it's so abrasive, right? It can cause erosions, ulcers, those sorts of things. So there has to be some sort of way for the, something to be able to kind of counteract or to lubricate the food as it travels by. And that's why you have the abundance of these mucus glands within the esophagus. Right? GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Essentially, that's where you get stomach acid and gastric juices up into the esophagus. That's going to cause a number of problems. We're going to talk about those in just a minute. But halitosis, again, this is something, right, especially for you, dental hygienists, something you might experience at some point. Halitosis, right, is just a horrific, putrid, awful smelling breath. Now, I'm not talking like, my dog, I love her dearly, but man, she has just some wicked breath, right? That's not what I'm talking about, right? Halitosis, right? There's a number of things which can lead to kind of like for instance, gum disease, right? Different things like pharyngeal pouches or esophageal pouches, for instance, can lead to halitosis, right? Mouth infections can lead to halitosis, right? There's a number of things which can lead to that. But it's not just, right, think of it this way. One of the things with halitosis, let's say if somebody has like an esophageal or a pharyngeal pouch, there's a little pouching that kind of forms. Let's say, right, that's gigantic. It wouldn't be that big, but let's just imagine it's that big. As you swallow food, liquid, whatever, some of it gets kind of lodged right here. And then it begins to kind of ferment and it begins to rot. Now, if you've ever taken meat, put it on your counter for 3 or 4 days, it starts to rot, it smells horrible. Same idea, right? Or if that infection, right, if there's an infection in the mouth, or let's say if there's gum disease where the gums become severely infected, right? If there's that much bacteria fermenting that much glucose, if there's that much bacteria causing that much breakdown, that can just lead to significant odor in the mouth, right? So again, that's halitosis. So peristalsis, as I mentioned, that's the process by which the esophagus is going to propel that bolus of food from the pharynx down into the stomach, right? So as I mentioned, it's kind of this pinching and pulling, right? The esophagus pinches inwards, and then there's this kind of pulling down motion, which propels that bolus of food down into the stomach. Now, when we get down here, something called a lower esophageal sphincter, that has to relax. And once it relaxes, that bolus of food can enter into the stomach. Now, here is the reason, the previous slide, right, when I mentioned GERD, right? Gastroesophageal reflux disease. This isn't just like, ah, man, I get indigestion. Nope. Actual like GERD is unbelievably. It's like somebody has just taken a hot poker and just kind of lodged it into your epigastric region. It is immensely painful, right? Not for everybody, but for the vast majority, right? And it's just this burning, kind of almost nauseating type of pain, right? Now, one of the biggest things that kind of leads to, right, GERD is the fact is kind of overeating, right? Think of it, when you put food in the stomach, right? When you put food in the stomach, that's going to cause a, well, when we eat food, that's going to cause the stomach to distend, right? The stomach's going to stretch out. One of the things which is going to cause the, that's going to cause the stomach to distend. When that happens, the stomach is going to start to contract. So as we eat food, the stomach distends, it enlarges, which then stimulates the stomach itself to begin to contract and start to produce vast quantities of all these different digestive secretions, right, from hydrochloric acid to pepsin, right? So if we have overeaten, the stomach is overly distended. If the stomach itself then starts to contract, well, think of it this way. Last week, right, it was 2 weeks ago, St. Patty's Day, made some cupcakes. I'm not a baker. My wife's definitely the baker. But for some reason, I felt, I don't know, I felt empowered. So I made some cupcakes. And I went to frost the cupcakes. And I grabbed a piping bag. And I just chocked this piping bag full of frosting, which was a problem. Because when I went to then go take the piping bag and kind of twist it shut, the problem was it was so full that the frosting came out, not of the kind of the tipped end, but out of the top of the bag. That is GERD, right? Or that is one of the main causes to GERD when I mentioned overeating, right? When you overeat, the stomach is so full of food that when it begins to contract, right, the amount of food in it overtakes the strength of the lower esophageal sphincter. So when that happens, all of the gastric juices, the hydrochloric acid, makes its way back up into the esophagus. Now that's a problem. The esophagus is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. That's the same stuff that your skin is lined with. That's the same stuff that your mouth is lined with, right? That stuff, that is not meant to be able to resist these, amazing, chemical invasion, if you will. Right? Think of a cut on your finger. It could be a paper cut. Just take some lemon juice, dump on it, you're like, it kind of hurts. Lemon juice has a pH of around, just north of 5. Stomach acid has a pH of around 1.5. It is the scale only goes to 1. And it's a 1.5. So we're talking about some immensely nasty, very potent, strong acid. Stratified squamous epithelium is not meant to deal with these, this sort of chemical irritant. So what happens is, as this stomach acid gets back up into the esophagus, over time, the esophagus, this lower part, begins to erode. Not the esophagus itself, but the wall begins to erode. So much so that something called metaplasia occurs. Something called Barrett's esophagus is when, again, over the long term, kind of constant exposure to stomach acid in this lower part of the esophagus actually changes the epithelium which is present. So instead of stratified squamous epithelium, the new epithelium which forms is simple columnar epithelium. That's the epithelium which lines the inside of the stomach. That's not what's supposed to line the stomach, or I'm sorry, that's not what's supposed to line the esophagus. So again, that's something called Barrett's esophagus. So overeating, right, obesity, even smoking. Smoking has shown to decrease the tone of the lower esophageal sphincter, so even that will put you at an increased risk of developing GERD. right? Some other connective tissue disorders and things like that. But really, by and large, the majority is just, again, obesity, overconsumption of food at a particular meal, and then smoking. Those are kind of the big ones. So as I mentioned, right, in order to get into the stomach, right, that lower esophageal sphincter that has to relax. So as it relaxes, that food can then enter into the stomach, right, at will, essentially. So once the food enters into the stomach, it begins to distend. As it distends more and more, that's going to stimulate the stomach to start to mix and mingle and churn and contract and start to combine all of this food with all of the different gastric juices. I say gastric juices, yeah, there's, as we mentioned, right, there are some things in anatomy and physiology where the name just sounds absurd because of how complicated and convoluted it is. When it came to the stomach, they're like, oh, what should we call all the stuff that the stomach produces? And somebody was like, oh, let's call it gastric juices. They were like, oh, that's a good idea. So I get it. Sometimes the names, sometimes they're simplistic. Other times they're obnoxiously not. So this is one of the cases where, again, get the gastric juices, like hydrochloric acid, pepsin, right, intrinsic factor, all these different secretions of the stomach. We'll talk about them in a second. As a whole, they're considered the gastric juices. Now, one of the things with the stomach, you can see how it has a number of different muscle layers. Right? There's 3 different muscle layers: the longitudinal layer, circular layer, the oblique layer. Right? This is meant to ensure that kind of every ounce, every little bit of food and liquid can get mixed and mingled with all the different gastric juices. Some other things is that not all the food that you consume at a given time is going to break down at the same rate. Right, you eat a cheeseburger, right? That bun on that cheeseburger, let's just say it wasn't anything whole grain. Let's just say you went for just a good old fashioned, just like Wonder Bread, whatever, like just a white, plain, standard hamburger bun. Right, that's going to break down, be digested and absorbed much, much more quickly than, let's say, the fat or the protein content from that cheeseburger. Right, so at the token, or at the time that the carbohydrate, right, because that's the hamburger bun, that's just carbohydrate, by the time that's being broken down here in the pylorus and leaving to go into the duodenum, the fatty content is still way up here in the fundus, yet to be broken down, because the rate in which these things break down are much, much different. That's another one of the reasons why people talk about, oh, should I eat carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates? Right, that's one of the things with simple carbohydrates is they do break down much more quickly. So the fact that they break down much more quickly, that means they're absorbed that much more quickly, which means you're going to be hungry that much sooner. Right? With fats, because of the fact that they take that much longer to digest, means you're going to be satiated for a much longer period of time. Yes, I realize it is not that simplistic, but as far as general rule of thumb, right, that's the way it's going to work. So, once we're inside of the stomach, right, as I mentioned, as we eat food, right, the stomach is going to distend. Now, not every single meal that we consume is going to be the same size, right? Not every day is Thanksgiving, right? My uncle, he treats eating like it's a competition. This guy, like, he goes into a buffet and they start to cry because they know they're losing money, right? There's different structures within the stomach. They're called rugae, the little folds. So therefore, if you happen to have a meal where you overconsume, if that's every meal for you, okay, that's fine, right? But these rugae begin to stretch out, right? They actually allow the stomach to distend to fit that large quantity of food. Some other things that we're going to see, right? The lower esophageal sphincter, we already pointed that out. The pyloric sphincter, right? This we hadn't talked about yet, but that's just like a valve, right? The lower esophageal sphincter up in here, that's the valve to get into the stomach. Down here, the pyloric sphincter, this essentially is the valve to get out of the stomach. Now, what's going to stimulate this? there's different reflexes. There's gastroenteric reflex, the gastrocolic reflex. There's different reflexes along the GI tract. They're almost kind of like checkpoints, where once food hits, certain checkpoints, that's when these different reflexes are initiated. As we go through the GI tract, again, we might get to one of them today, but as we go through the GI tract, we're going to talk about these different quote-unquote checkpoints where the reflexes themselves are actually stimulated. So again, here's just one of those kind of a gross anatomic model of the stomach itself. You can see how pronounced the rugae are, right? They're significant, right? You can see them all throughout the rugae, or all throughout the stomach, whether it's up here in the fundus, right down here in the body, whether it's up here in the pylorus, right? You can see, you can see the size of these rugae, right? Over time, with enough distension of the stomach, these rugae can begin to kind of flatten out, right, and become less pronounced, right? Just like elastic, right? Is the more you stretch elastic, the more it kind of wears out. Same idea with rugae. Now, in the actual wall of the stomach, so these gastric juices that I talked about, right? The gastric juices, the hydrochloric acid, the mucus, the pepsin, these are going to come from something called the gastric pits. In the wall of the stomach, right, there is all these gastric pits. They're little tiny holes, right? Within that hole is a pit, and that pit is lined with different cells. And depending on what cell it is, dictates what it's going to actually produce. So we see, first off, no, on the exam, there will not be an image of this, and you will not have to identify what cell is which one, right? But within the gastric pit, right, the surface mucus cell, right, that's something which is going to secrete mucus. I know, again, its name, tell you what, it's genius. Same thing with the mucous neck cell. These are going to produce mucus, and they are going to produce massive amounts of mucus. Massive amounts of mucus. Right? This is going to prevent the stomach from actually digesting itself. Right? Because think of it. I loved it. There's an episode of The Simpsons. Right? It's come down probably 20 years ago at this point. Homer goes to some fair, and there's some carny or someone there selling these ridiculously hot peppers. Homer's like, I can eat one, goes up, merely touches it to his tongue, and he flips out because it's so hot. So then he runs around trying to find something to cool off his mouth, nothing will work. He grabs a candle and he drinks the candle wax. That coats his tongue, that coats his throat, coats his stomach, and he feels fine. He then goes back over and eats like 20 of these peppers and starts to hallucinate, and this is just a great episode. But the whole point is, just like that wax coated his mouth, coated his stomach, coated his esophagus, that's what the mucus does. Right? The mucus coats the inside of your stomach. Right? When there's insufficient release of this mucus, right? That's one of the reasons why somebody will develop a gastric or a stomach ulcer. Right? And these are unbelievably painful. Right? Think of it. This mucus is meant to protect the stomach. Well, let's back up. The hydrochloric acid, it's meant to break down connective tissue, proteins, that sort of thing. It's meant to break down tissues. Well, your stomach is just tissue. That's all it is. So there has to be something there to protect it from itself. Right? And that's the mucus. Right? That's why our stomach produces massive quantities of this stuff. And when it doesn't, when it can't produce mucus in certain areas of the stomach, that's when you develop gastric ulcers or stomach ulcers. Right? It used to be thought, oh, gastric ulcers, oh man, you're stressed, or oh man, gotta lay off the spicy foods. No, that's not what causes gastric ulcers, right? We've now figured out, well, now, years, but something called H. pylori or Helicobacter pylori. It's a bacteria that's going to cause stomach ulcers to form. Something else, the other most common reason why stomach ulcers would form is from chronic ingestion of NSAIDs, again, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Again, they too are going to inhibit the production of this protective lining of the stomach. It can lead to gastric bleeding and those sorts of things. Another cell present in the gastric pit is a parietal cell. Now the parietal cell, this is going to secrete one of two things, but it's going to secrete two things. Intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is something that your body needs to absorb vitamin B12. At the same token, the parietal cell produces hydrochloric acid. Intrinsic factor requires the presence of hydrochloric acid to become active. So let's just imagine hypothetically, oh, I don't have enough acid, or I don't have enough hydrochloric acid. That means the intrinsic factor will not become activated, which means you will not absorb sufficient levels of vitamin B12, meaning you will become vitamin B12 deficient. And that is where you will develop something called pernicious anemia. There's many different types of anemia, right? Iron deficiency anemia, by far and away the most common. Right? Think of this one as being, vitamin B12 deficient, or B12 deficiency anemia. It's just called pernicious anemia, right? So there has to be both the production of intrinsic factor along with hydrochloric acid for this absorption to take place. A chief cell, another cell which is present within the gastric pit. You see, this is going to lead to the breakdown of proteins and lipids. The chief cell secretes something called pepsinogen. That pepsinogen, in the presence of hydrochloric acid, is going to convert into pepsinogen. The pepsinogen, is going to convert into something called pepsin. That pepsin is what's going to begin the breakdown of proteins. Lastly, from the chief cell is going to secrete something called gastric lipase. That gastric lipase is going to begin the breakdown of, again, lipids or fats. Now, how is it that we actually can begin to stimulate the release of hydrochloric acid or pepsinogen or mucus or whatever? How is it our stomach knows, hey, there's stuff inside of me, we gotta release this? Part of that is where the G cell comes into play, right? The G cell. The G cell secretes the hormone gastrin, stimulates release of gastric juices, and promotes gastric emptying. Yeah. What actually happens is, as we eat, the stomach begins to distend. As the stomach distends, that's going to stimulate the release of gastrin. Right. So as gastrin is released, that's then in turn going to stimulate the further release of pepsinogen, hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor, etc. It's not the only route. Right? We're going to look at a number of the ways that these different secretions are actually stimulated. So one of the things here, we see what controls the release of these gastric juices, beginning with hydrochloric acid. Acetylcholine, right? We talked about acetylcholine before when we talked about the neuromuscular junction. We talked about the actual contraction of muscle. Right? Acetylcholine was the neurotransmitter which crossed the cleft, bound to the muscle cell, right? It bound to the acetylcholine receptor on the sarcolemma, and then caused the muscle cell to become active or depolarize. All right, that's one of the ways. Gastrin, right? Caused by stomach distension. Yeah, as the stomach distends, that's going to stimulate the release of gastrin from the G cell. That's two. The third way is through the presence of histamine. Right? Neuroendocrine cells, mast cells, basophils. Yeah, we've all heard of histamine before, right? Or if you haven't heard of histamine, you've undoubtedly, well, we've talked about it before in lectures, so I hope you've heard of it. But something called an antihistamine, if you have allergies or anything like that. right? If you've taken an antihistamine, right? Mast cells and basophils can release and do release something called histamine. Histamine is a potent pro-inflammatory. That doesn't mean it's a bad guy, not at all. Inflammation is 100% necessary for us to exist. It absolutely must be there, right? Just like chocolate cake, right? One piece is great. Two, still pretty good. Whole chocolate cake, that's a bad thing. Same thing with histamine. A little bit of histamine, it's a great thing. Too much, that's a bad thing, right? You get stung by a bee, that localized redness that you get, that stems from the release of histamine, right? Because as you get stung by that bee, that toxin begins to destroy all of that, not all, but begins to destroy some of the cells and tissues in that area. The histamine begins to attract all of the different white blood cells, phagocytes, these reparative blood cells to the inflamed area to help repair, to help further break down, quell the inflammation, and then repair that particular area, right? So histamine is one of those molecules which can also help to stimulate the release of hydrochloric acid. As far as mucus cells, we see the initial acts of eating, right? Seeing food, smelling food, putting the food in your mouth, chewing the food. All of these things are going to stimulate the release of the mucus, right? You want that mucus there before the hydrochloric acid is there, or you want that hydrochloric acid there before the pepsin or before the gastric lipase is there. Right, so that's why the mucus cells are stimulated very early on in the eating process, or even in the digestion process. The G cells, again, through gastric distension, which we talked about, and then the chief cells through the presence of hydrochloric acid. Right, once the hydrochloric acid is present, that's what's going to stimulate the G cell to release gastric lipase and pepsinogen. So the food that we consume, right, once it gets into the stomach, it's not really called food anymore. Once that food mixes and mingles and combines with the acids in the stomach, now it's something called chyme. Something called chyme. Right? Think of this acidic slurry of food. We see as chyme accumulates, the stomach distends, stimulating the enterogastric reflex. So as the stomach distends, right, that's going to stimulate the enterogastric reflex, which is what's going to cause the stomach to empty its contents into the duodenum. Right, so the other problem with overeating is, right, our mouth, our stomach, our intestines all have contributions to digestion. If we've overconsumed, that's going to lead to the premature release of these, stomach contents into the duodenum. So therefore, the digestion, which was performed by the hydrochloric acid or by the pepsin or by the gastric lipase, that's minimized because the food is, quote unquote, kicked out of the stomach prematurely. And from the stomach, it's going to enter into the duodenum. Right, so I'll kind of finish this topic on, finish this presentation on this slide, because this slide leads into the intestines and really where the bulk of digestion is going to occur. Right, I've used this example before, but think of the intestinal wall. Right, the intestinal wall is this thin wall that, unless nutrients get through it, nothing's getting into the body. Well, think of a screen. Right, unless that water gets through the screen, nothing's getting into the house. All right, so if I take this big chunk of ice and I, press it up against the screen, or I set it on that screen, is that ice going to get inside of the house? No. Just like if I took a bite of a cheeseburger, is that big cheeseburger going to somehow get its way into my intestines and through my intestinal wall into the blood. No, it's way too big. So we've got to break down that block of ice. Right? First, we break it up. Let's say the ice I could smash with a sledgehammer. If it's a cheeseburger, I can smash it up with my teeth. Right? Once it's smaller and smaller particles. With the ice, I can dump salt all over it. Right? If it's the food, I can cover it in saliva. I can cover it in gastric lipase, pepsin, right? Amylase, trypsin, all these different digestive enzymes, all these different gastric juices. I can mix them in this food, and the food begins to break down further and further and further until it's a size that can actually fit through this intestinal wall. Right, so at that point, that's where I'm going to pause, and I will pick up here on the next presentation.